Hello and welcome back to the APUS History Curriculum. In this set of videos, we're going to look at the 8th time period covered in APUSH, which covers the years 1945 through the year 1980, which are both some of the most prosperous and some of the most tumultuous times in our history. The key concepts for the era focus on the U.S. continuing to assert itself as a global power while engaging in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, while trying to create a free market global economy and an international security system. In addition, there is the emergence of new movements for civil rights and debates about the expanding role of the federal government. The final key concept focuses on the economic and demographic changes that resulted in tremendous changes to American society, politics, and culture. In Unit 10, the topics we will look at include the Cold War from 1945 to 1980, the Red Scare, the economy after 1945, culture after 1945, early steps in the civil rights movement in the 1940s and 1950s, America as a world power, the Vietnam War, the Great Society, the African American civil rights movement in the 1960s, the expansion of the civil rights movement, the development of a youth culture in the 1960s, the environment and natural resources from 1968 to 1980, and the American society in transition. So in this video, we will be looking at topic 8.2, the Cold War from 1945 to 1980, which is a huge time period and doesn't even cover the entire length of the Cold War itself, since it will last well into Era 9. But here I will split it into two phases, with a more detailed look at the early part of the Cold War, followed by a brief overview of key parts of the later Cold War that are covered in more detail in later topic videos. So let's get to it. Wartime partnership between the U.S. and the Soviet Union really only existed because of the threat posed by Nazism. But once that was defeated, the two superpowers began a long struggle for political, economic, and military dominance. Both sides increased their military spending and sought to extend their influence around the world. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, FDR had recognized that cooperation with the Soviets was necessary to preserve a permanent peace. So rather than demanding full self-determination and democratic elections in Poland and other Eastern European countries, he compromised with a promise from Joseph Stalin to hold free and unfettered elections at a future time. By the time the Potsdam Conference was held in July 1945, FDR had been replaced by Harry Truman, who felt more of a need to challenge the Soviets, who by then had established Soviet-controlled communist governments in Poland, Hungary, and Romania. These two conferences set the stage for communist rule to descend over Eastern Europe, and the competition over expansion of influence to begin. This also seriously affected the administration of Germany, which had been divided into 4 zones of occupation, with the British, French, Americans, and Soviets each controlling a sector, both in the nation as a whole and in the capital, Berlin, which was itself wholly within the Soviet zone. In 1946, while visiting the U.S., Winston Churchill accused Stalin of raising an iron curtain around Eastern Europe and allowing police governments to rule the people. Now, Truman didn't want to see communism expand any further if the people living in those countries would be subjected to such controlling governments. So the U.S. began pursuing a containment policy towards communists, hoping to prevent its spread beyond where it already existed. Growing unrest in the nations of Greece and Turkey provided the opportunity for Soviet influence to grow there. So in 1947, Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, which would provide $400 million in economic and military aid to assist the free people there to resist a totalitarian regime. The funding worked, and the Soviet influence in those countries was eliminated. But the precarious economic situation in Europe threatened to collapse the fragile peace in Western Europe as well, and the Allies feared this could open the door to communism spreading beyond the Eastern Bloc nations. And so beginning in 1948, the U.S. gave over $12 billion in economic support to help rebuild Western European economies under the Marshall Plan. The money would have to be spent buying U.S. goods, which is part of the reason why the U.S. did not have a post-war recession, as usually happened after wars. It rebuilt cities, modernized industry, and generally made Europe prosperous again. The Marshall Plan also antagonized the Soviet Union because the Western Allies wanted an economically stable Europe, Germany in particular, to ensure political stability and prevent future conflict, whereas the Soviets wanted all heavy industry in Germany dismantled so that it could no longer support any military efforts, because the Soviet Union had lost at least 20 million people in World War II alone. By the time of the plan's end in 1951, industrial production in Europe had increased 35%, and agricultural production was above pre-war levels. Poverty and starvation had all but disappeared, and standards of living began increasing dramatically. Austerity measures and rationing were reduced by the governments of Western Europe, which in turn reduced dissent and brought about political stability, which reduced communist influence in the region. Some of those Marshall Plan funds were earmarked for West Berlin, so in June of 1948, the Soviets began a blockade of all traffic going into the city. Instead of withdrawing like Stalin had expected, Truman refused to leave and had the Western Allies begin a massive airlift of supplies into the city, flying over 200,000 flights in 1 year, delivering nearly 9,000 tons of goods each day. By May of 1949, the blockade had been lifted, since it had been ineffective and the main crisis was over, although the mistrust remained. The crisis in Berlin prompted Western European nations to join in a collective security pact with the United States and Canada, and in April of 1949, this military alliance known as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, began. The initial 12 nations participating agreed that an attack on one was an attack on all. Those nations also agreed to the formal creation of the Federal Republic of Germany as a nation, West Germany. In response, the Soviets created the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, and in 1955 established their own military alliance in Eastern Europe known as the Warsaw Pact. Essentially, the two superpowers had formalized the Cold War by dividing the European continent. Atomic developments also played a critical role in the emergence of the Cold War. At first, the U.S. was the only possessor of nuclear technology, but in September 1949, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb. The U.S. National Security Council then had to reassess its strategy. Their report, known as NSC 68, described the Soviets as wanting to dominate all of Europe and Asia, and that the West needed to rebuild its defenses to surpass that of the Soviets. This prompted the U.S. to develop the thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb that was 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan, as well as build up its conventional or non-nuclear forces. At first, Truman was a bit reluctant to follow this path, but events in Asia changed his mind. In 1949, after years of civil war in China, communist forces under Mao Zedong defeated forces supporting Chiang Kai-shek, who fled to Taiwan. Mao aligned the People's Republic of China with the Soviets, prompting Truman to refuse to recognize its government and blocked its admission to the United Nations. Taiwan would continue to represent China in the UN. That turned attention to Korea. Korea had been occupied by Japan, and after its surrender at the end of World War II, Soviet troops occupied the northern portion, while U.S. troops occupied the southern portion of the country. The dividing line between the two was approximately the 38th parallel. Free elections for a unified Korea were promised, but never happened because the Soviets installed a communist government in the north and a pro-American government was established in the south. Then in June 1950, the North Korean army invaded South Korea to try and force unification, beginning the Korean War. Relatively quickly, the North Koreans were able to push all the way to the port city of Pusan, at the southern tip of the peninsula. The UN Security Council met and authorized the use of UN troops in a police action to fight against the invaders. Interestingly, the Soviet Union was not present at the UN meeting because they had been boycotting the UN because the Chinese Communist delegate was not allowed to represent China. And since the Soviets boycotted the meeting, they did not use their veto power. The UN military effort was led by American General Douglas MacArthur. who landed an invasion at Incheon, a difficult proposition because of the geography. But the invasion force was successful, making this the major turning point in the entire war. The UN troops then drove the North Koreans back above the 38th parallel. At this point, China threatened to join the war on the side of the North Koreans if UN forces crossed that 38th parallel. But the UN and Truman didn't take the threat seriously and advanced all the way up almost to the Chinese border. Chinese troops then joined the fight, surrounding the entire U.S. 1st Division and forcing the largest military evacuation ever, forcing a retreat all the way back to the 38th parallel. Pretty much from this point on, Truman favored waging a limited war, something that General MacArthur publicly criticized. For his insubordination, MacArthur would be replaced. Peace talks would remain stalled for almost 2 years. Finally, in July 1953, the two sides agreed to a ceasefire that technically remains in effect today. The war itself ended in a draw, with the 38th parallel still dividing the two nations. More than 55,000 Americans were killed, with over 100,000 wounded. 300,000 in South Korea were dead, mostly civilians, and an estimated 1.5 million North Koreans were killed as well. The war also had significant consequences for the U.S. First, since this was conducted without congressional declaration of war, Truman had set the precedent for future undeclared wars. His refusal to use atomic bombs also set basic ground rules for Cold War conflicts. It also expanded U.S. involvement in Asia, transforming containment into a global policy. And it saw a major military buildup, with defense expenditures from roughly $13 billion in 1950, which was 1/3 of the federal budget, growing to $50 billion in 1953, which was 2/3 of the federal budget. After Eisenhower came to office, U.S. foreign policy became more global, more militarized, and more expensive. New technologies, such as the introduction of the B-52 Stratofortress, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and nuclear submarines, allowed the U.S. to be in a constant state of military readiness and able to project its power globally. The space race also grew out of this Cold War, with the rockets that would launch the first satellite. The Soviets were first with Sputnik in 1957, put the first person into space. The Soviets were also first with Yuri Gagarin, and put the first man on the moon. This time it was the Americans who were first in 1969. Stalin's death seemed to promote a lessening of the Cold War, but the Soviet invasion of Hungary put down an uprising against the Soviet-supported government in 1956, the shooting down of Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union in 1960, and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 all escalated matters. Although the installation of a direct phone line between the Oval Office and the Kremlin allowed the leaders of both countries to communicate quickly and avoid another potentially catastrophic confrontation. The Vietnam War in the 1960s and 1970s became yet another proxy war between the U.S. and the Soviets, before President Richard Nixon began an era of détente, easing the tensions between the two countries, with the strategic arms limitation talks resulting in anti-ballistic missile treaties, discussions about biological weapons, summit meetings to discuss diplomatic cooperation. The two even cooperated on the Apollo-Soyuz test project, a joining up of two spacecraft while in orbit, before tensions increased once again in the late 1970s, and Reagan was elected on a platform that opposed to the concessions of détente. Well, that about covers what you need to know about Topic 8.2, the Cold War from 1945 to 1980. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.